Good evening, guys. Tonight we are going to be following up what we talked about on Monday in class, and we are going to be actually talking about the Spanish-American War, and more importantly than that, the results that followed as at the conclusion of the Spanish-American War. So our learning target for Wednesday is going to be I can explain how the Spanish-American War affected U.S. imperialism. So to get started, war breaks out. We know how the war broke out. We know what happened as far as yellow journalism, the De Lome letter, the sinking of the USS Maine. Don't forget the economic factors in Cuba, the sugar and all that stuff. But what we have to remember is that when it comes down to it, the Spanish do not want to fight us. Okay, they do not want war at all. Mostly because they know that they're going to lose. So what's ironic about the Spanish-American War, even though it says it is the Spanish-American War, the war starts in the Philippines. Now remember, when we looked at our map, when we talked about Hawaii and China, the Philippines was also located in the Pacific. The reason that we chose to postpone talking about the Philippines until today was because the Philippines was a Spanish colony. And it had been for hundreds of years. That is until the Spanish-American War. With the Pacific Fleet going on with the U.S. Navy, we convincingly win the war in the Philippines, which is just the first step to us ultimately winning the Spanish-American War. Okay, so just a quick recap. The Spanish-American War starts out in the Philippines. The U.S. Navy in the Pacific easily wins the battle in the Philippines. So now we're going to move on next to the actual war in Cuba. So the first thing that happens is that the Navy blocks off Cuba. Okay, so our Navy during this time period is far superior. It's probably the first or second best Navy in the entire world, right alongside Great Britain. The problem is during this time period, and again, we're right around 1898 or so, our Army is not very good. Our Army is very, very ragtag. And most of the people that we get fighting for us in the Spanish-American War are more volunteers. And so we really need strong leadership to get us through to help us win the Spanish-American War. And that's where the Rough Riders come into place. And the Rough Riders were a group of 17,000 men, and they were volunteers, but they were led by a guy that I'm sure you all remember, and they were led by Teddy Roosevelt. And the reason for that picture up there is because that picture is a picture of DMX, and DMX's rap group is the Rough Riders. So, anyway, Teddy Roosevelt leads the Rough Riders into Cuba, and he is responsible for our most famous victory in Cuba on land. Okay, so with the help of Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, America wins the war in Cuba as well. All right, so we win the war in the Philippines, we win the war in Cuba, and that's pretty much it. So if it seems like it went fast, it did. The reason for that is because it only lasts 4 months. The entire war lasts only 4 months, and we see a lot of things take place as a result of the Spanish-American War, how we become basically an imperialistic power. The first thing that happens is that Cuba is granted independence. Remember, we were fighting for Cuba, the idea of Cuba Libre, free Cuba, so Cuba is given its independence. Next, Puerto Rico and a little territory named Guam, which is also in the Pacific, is given to the U.S. by Spain. And the third thing that happens is the Philippines is annexed to the U.S. Remember, we talked about what annexing means. It's just when one territory takes over another. The Philippines is annexed to the U.S., by Spain for $20 million. And all of these conditions, these three conditions, all take place in a treaty known as the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the Spanish-American War. So now let's look at the U.S. and its new territories and how we kind of are affected by getting these new territories. First thing is Puerto Rico. Now, Puerto Rico was kind of confused because some people wanted independence in Puerto Rico. Some people kind of wanted to remain part of the U.S. So there's not a whole lot that goes on with Puerto Rico other than what happens now, which means that they are still just a U.S. territory. Now, it gets kind of interesting with Cuba. Even though we grant Cuba independence, we essentially kind of look out for Cuba for a while. And what's put into play is something known as the Platt Amendments. And the Platt Amendments are kind of our guide to looking over Cuba. So there are a few things that take place in the Platt Amendments. So Cuba cannot make a treaty without the U.S. consenting to it and without the U.S. agreeing to that treaty. And Cuba was not allowed to go into debt, so we basically watched over Cuba's finances. And the U.S. could also buy or lease land for military purposes. So the greatest example of this is Guantanamo Bay, which is in Cuba but is still a U.S. Military base. And the actual terminology of this is that Cuba became what's known as a protectorate. And it sounds exactly like what it is. So it's when a country is partially controlled by a stronger country. So the easiest way to look at it is that during this time period, the U.S. kind of serves as the big brother to Cuba. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is the Philippines. So people in the Philippines are upset because for hundreds of years they tried to gain their independence from Spain. And now that Spain is out of their way, they're thinking, this is great, we're not going to have our independence. The problem is that the U.S. comes in now, and the U.S. wants to take control of the Philippines. So what we have as a result of that is the Philippine-American War. Oops, I want to erase that, sorry. And the end result of the Philippine-American War is pretty much the same. The Philippines still serve as part of U.S. territory up until 1946. So what the Philippines get is they get a lot of education, and culture. And this is big for them because it allows them to become a lot more civilized. And we talked about this idea of white superiority and white man's burden. But this really does help because what we do is we ship a lot of young teachers to the Philippines. And the amount of kids that attend school in the Philippines and the amount of education in the Philippines skyrockets as a result. So this really is a positive thing. Now, the Philippines was run by a, quote, governor appointed by the president. And during this time period, the governor of the Philippines was William Howard Taft, who we've already talked about. Now, what do we get? Again, we get another presence in the Pacific. As far as military goes, and we also get to control the economics of the Philippines. So, because of the Spanish-American War, we get more Pacific influence. We also essentially control all of the Caribbean now with Puerto Rico and Cuba. So this is huge for the United States because now the U.S. officially becomes an imperial power. And that is the key that we need to get out of this. Because of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. goes from being a player in imperialism to becoming an imperial power. Okay, so if we can explain how the Spanish-American War affected American imperialism, we are good to go for today. That's all I've got. I will see you guys on Wednesday. I hope you enjoy your day off or have enjoyed your day off. I will see you then.